Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brown People Problems, a podcast where I, Nikita, your host, sit down with guests around the world to chat about what it looks like to navigate life while being brown. Today, we're chatting about substance use and addictions in the brown community. Please take this as a trigger warning. If you need to step away from this episode to take care of yourself, please do so. We will understand. But if you'd like to keep listening, we're okay with that too. Today, to talk about this topic, I have with me Jeevan Atwal. Jeevan is a Canadian Certified Counsellor, proud mama, and a first-generation Canadian from BC here in Canada. She works from a holistic and trauma-informed lens. She utilizes different approaches in her work, which include like person-centered therapy, mindfulness, inner child work. I know that's really trending on TikTok right now. CBT, and most recently, she's acquired EMDR in her roster as well. Jeevan basically believes that all individuals have the power inside themselves to make changes they need or desire, but often they just need a safe space and a supportive person to guide them along the way. When Jeevan is not in her therapist role, she actually really enjoys spending time outdoors with loved ones and cooking up a tasty meal. And when you're living in BC, you better enjoy your time outdoors. It's absolutely beautiful. But thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation, Jeevan.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk about this topic for sure. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I know it can be... It's one that we actually haven't done on this podcast yet, just talk about like substance use. And I wanted to just have this conversation. We're going to obviously like a 50-minute or whatever, however long this episode is going to be. It's not really going to do justice to the entire complexity of this topic, but maybe it's enough for us to kind of just get started and get our listeners a little bit more like familiar with this.
Right? Definitely. Yeah, I think just talking about it, starting the conversation is something that's so needed in the South Asian community, but also just with everyone that's dealing with loved ones that are dealing with substance use or they're dealing with it themselves. So yeah, anything I think is helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we know like substance use issues are so prevalent, right? Like in the brown community and, globally, sure. But even if you just look at within like the South Asian context on the continent, there's a lot. And then when you look at the South Asian overseas population, especially in the West here in North America, it's quite prevalent. It's something that not recently, but I learned about only a few years ago. I just never maybe noticed it too much around me because it's so well hidden and hushed up.
And also hidden, hushed up, I think. And also, I think for certain individuals in the population, accepted in a way. Like I know for myself, I grew up in an environment where it was kind of just what you did when you got together. It was, encouraged like to drink more and that kind of almost, I think for the men in general that I saw, it was the more you drink or drink more, it kind of proves like you're a man in a way, in that kind of sense. So it's when you kind of come up in that environment, it's hard to really see that, this could be, a substance that can be misused or that it's not healthy when used inappropriately and things like that.
Yeah, it's like socially accepted, right? Especially alcohol, like it's socially like rewarded, because if you're that person who goes to a party and says, actually, no, I'm going to pass on a drink, you just get bombarded with questions all around, right? And people kind of like put this like serious look on their faces and they say, well, is everything okay? It's just so expected of you to drink.
Yeah. And I mean, to be completely transparent, I'm that person that will say, I'm okay for today, or, I'm not drinking. And it's almost like, oh, what's wrong?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like, no, it's just, I'm making that choice. But I think because majority of people do like to have a drink, which, is completely fine. When someone says they're not going to do it, it's like, oh, you're not doing what most people are doing. Like, what's going on?
Yeah. You feel like a bit of an outcast.
A little bit. Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah. I'm recently on a drinking hiatus myself for the last few months. And, and I absolutely like love people in my life, and they're very great and they're very caring. But every time, I kind of go out with the same group of people, I get this well-intentioned, but this still sort of like surprise level. Still, you're still not drinking? Okay, like when are you gonna drink again? So it's alcohol is one of those substances that is just so normalized. And I also don't want to insinuate that the problem is the substance, because we know that it's not the substance that you're using, right? That's
right.
The issue. It's why you're using it. So I'm wondering, Jeevan, if you can, just for our listeners, define what actually is addiction.
Yeah. So I think, of course, there's so many definitions out there, but one that I really like and one that I use, because it kind of encompasses all the different varieties of, substances and impacts it can have, is basically it can be a chronic or compulsive need for whether it's a substance, a behavior, or an activity that someone is partaking in that is having some sort of physical, psychological, social effect. And it's a harmful effect that it's having. And it can often cause well-defined symptoms of withdrawal when you're being abstinent from it. So whether that's anger, irritability, physiological symptoms, sweating, shaking, nausea. I think for a lot of people, when you think of substance use or substance abuse or alcoholism or any of those, it's always some sort of negative, quote unquote, negative substance that is causing those, but it can actually be any behavior, any activity that is having a negative impact on a person's life individually.
Yeah, I really like, how you put that together, that it could be a substance, a behavior, or any sort of practice, right? A compulsive practice that can become an addiction.
Or chronic, as I said too. I think in this community with like alcohol, for example, right? Like people use the term functional alcoholic. So it doesn't always look like a typical addiction you might see in, textbooks or on TV. Sometimes it is just that long-term, maybe 2 drinks a night. But I think the question becomes, what would happen if it wasn't available or if it was taken away, right? What effect would that have on your overall well-being?
Yeah. Do you mind repeating that definition one more time? Because there was something else in there that I wanted to reflect on, because that sounded really nice.
Yeah. So a chronic or compulsive need for a substance, behavior or activity that is having some sort of harmful physical, psychological, social effect, and then often causing like well-defined symptoms for an individual upon withdrawing from it or kind of trying to abstain from it.
Yeah, what jumps out at me is the behavior or activity, right? Because when we think of addiction, we can tend to have a very sort of narrow kind of view of it. But in activity or behavior, that's very inclusive, because, shopping can be addictive. You can shop compulsively, eat compulsively. And that's a sort of addiction behavior that we see more of in like women of color, right?
Yeah.
Is their relationship to food.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think addiction varies between, I think it's so different even within the South Asian community between men and women. And I'm not sure how much experience you have around this, but for what I've seen, when men have this addiction, it's almost, it's hushed up, it's hidden, it's almost accepted in a way that like, that's just what men do in the community. And it's sometimes almost like, oh, there must be another reason that this person is drinking. So it's not on that individual. It's always someone else must have made you upset or made you angry or didn't treat you right. And then when you look at women, it's, how could you do that to the family name? How do you have no self-control? You should be ashamed of yourself. So like the perspective, I think, just from the outer community around whether it's a male or female having the addiction or the substance use problem definitely influences how the person themselves sees kind of the behavior that they're engaging into.
Yeah, surprise, surprise, we're more lenient with boys. Who knew?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
Shocking, I know.
Shocking revelation. I think you're right. There is a lot more leniency. As you were kind of saying that, I was thinking of this, like, really kind of stereotypical thing that you hear a lot of maybe older people kind of say when they find out like a boy in their family is struggling with addictions. They'll say something along the lines of, oh, this friend got him hooked onto it, or, someone else got my poor son addicted to something. And there's this very like huge like lack of accountability. Right? And we know that we're not assuming a place of shame and blame with addictions, right? Because we know that it's a lot more nuanced than that. But I think in what you're saying is how we treat the person who is forming some sort of a dependency issue really then impacts how they themselves internalize what's going on for them.
Right. Yeah. And I've had male clients in the past kind of come from this environment that we just kind of spoke about.
Yeah.
And there's almost this sense of like resentment for them to be like, why didn't someone hold me accountable, which I've seen. Right. And it's hard because when you come back to that concept of shame or blame, then they blame themselves, they blame their family. And it's a lot of work around like the word intergenerational trauma comes up because it's like you only know what you know. So your parents or your family probably thought they were protecting you, and you were this, I don't know, young adult that maybe didn't. That's what you were taught. That's what you learned, right? So you only know what you know. And that's why I really come from a place of having the knowledge of like what addiction truly is so powerful. It's not just a choice of I'm going to get up and drink today, or I'm going to get up and use a substance today. It's so much deeper rooted than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that intergenerational trauma piece, right? You hit the nail on the head there, because you know what you know, but you also don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
And how we parent the next generation is so deeply informed by how we were parented, right? And
yeah.
I mean, we could go down this tangent forever, but
different episode.
Yes. Yeah. If you're listening, the last episode with Dr. Sodhi, we talked about intergenerational trauma as well, but not necessarily in the context of parenting, but
right.
I think that's like relevant here.
Yeah.
So what's your experience been like working with addictions in the South Asian community?
For me, the interest started because of personal experiences. A close family member deals with, an alcohol problem.
Yeah.
So that's actually where I would say I have most of my experience is on the personal side of just, and then going through school and then having that therapist hat to put on. And, you look at, the people around you or your relationships and you go, I wonder what the barriers have been to support, or I wonder why this person doesn't reach out, or why there isn't enough supports for people from different cultures and stuff like that. But the limited experience I do have, I mean, it's so limited because I think there's that huge barrier around shame and bringing shame to the family name. For the few clients I have worked with openly about, their addiction. And when I say that, I mean people that are able to say, I have so-and-so problem, because I think that's always the first step with helping someone, right? Like you can't put that on someone. Oh, you have this. They have to be able to come to that realization on their own. A lot of the experience is first working through that fear of people finding out even that they're in therapy, or, like someone seeing them coming to therapy for any reason, really. When you look at the South Asian community, it's not something that's promoted, I would say. But I think for a lot of people that I've worked with, like a lot of the, I don't want to say direct causes because I can't make causation statements, but a lot of it is that kind of fight between, or debate in their own mind about being of, the Indian culture, or their parents coming here from India, and then also being Canadian. And the nuances of that seem to lead people to feel like they can't cope with, or don't know how to work through, like, how do I respect my culture and respect my parents, but also form my own identity? and, stay true to the values I've developed now being born in Canada.
Yeah, immigration stress is very real. Acculturation stress is very real, and navigating, dual cultural identities, that's really, really stressful. And, exactly like how you said, addiction is not about what you're using or what you're doing. It's about why.
Yeah.
What's happening for you? Like, what is this thing, whether it's alcohol or whatever other substance, or the eating, the food, whatever, what is this doing for you that you can't do for yourself?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for the South Asian community in particular, what I've seen is a lot of it is either they don't have the tools, to emotionally regulate or problem solve. Because even from personal experience and working with families, a lot of it is, we don't talk about the problems. We just push them aside or we brush them under the rug. And then that builds, right, with your emotions, with your feelings. And a lot of the time people turn to substances because they just don't know how to cope or don't know how to deal with the issue at hand.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So they may turn to food or to substances to feel better.
Yeah.
Right? To regulate themselves.
Yeah. And with food, I feel like it's not talked about enough, but just like that instant gratification, because when something tastes good, you're like, oh, this feels so good, or this tastes so good. Like we all have that thing that we're like, I'm craving that, or, I'm not having a great day. I would love to, have a bowl of ice cream or whatever it is for you. And it's just like that instant, like, oh, I just finally feel some sort of positivity or gratification in this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's often just that act of eating is what kind of like soothes the nervous system, right? As opposed to even like what you're eating.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes when those actions become comforting, right? Your body remembers that.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the more you kind of repeat that behavior, the more ingrained it gets, and the more kind of like solidified it becomes.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that, because I was thinking about, like, we kind of touched on it a little bit before the podcast about like how people will say, well, can't they just choose not to do it? Right. Or like they don't have the power to just not do it. It's not that hard. Just stop doing it. Like you hear all these messages that make it seem so easy, but like whatever the dependency is on, or the addiction is with, it actually, and I know for alcohol and certain illicit drugs for sure, it alters your brain. Like the way that it looks, the way that it works. So I don't know if you'd like me to share.
Yes, please. Let's talk about that. Yeah.
But using a substance like alcohol, or like any illicit drug, or even, with eating in that, same category, that substance actually stimulates the reward center of the brain, and the release of dopamine that happens, that release right after you do that behavior. So again, like you're saying, it's not always the substance, but it can be the actual behavior. So the taking a sip of the drink, or using a drug, or hitting like, buy on Amazon or whatever it may be, it causes those pleasurable effects that give you the incentive to continue to repeat that behavior. Right. And then while it's doing that, while these chemicals are being released and these pathways are being built, it's actually weakening your kind of pathways in your decision-making part of the brain. So in the prefrontal cortex. So it's kind of simultaneously kind of doing this.
Oh, yeah.
And then because your brain gets so used to that, when you're like, maybe I'm going to try to stop, or maybe I'm going to try to stop drinking or shopping so much, or I'm going to set a limit, those pathways kind of go, whoa, where's that thing I need? And then you get those withdrawal effects. And that's why, when the withdrawal period can be so hard, because people are like, oh, if I just, used that thing or acted in that behavior, these feelings would go away. And so that short term is sometimes, in that moment for people, that short term feeling better is almost the easier route to go than, following through with that long term, because it can be hard to see like the light at the end of the tunnel when you're in that place, for sure.
Yeah, no, that was really well said. That's a really great explanation of it. I think, yeah, because there's so much shame and stigma around substance use, right? That it almost becomes a moral flaw.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. They really hold against someone. But like in actuality, and underneath the surface of what seems like a conscious choice, it's more complicated than that.
Right. And I think we talked a little bit about the social acceptance of like drinking in particular, and some drugs that people use recreationally. When you're doing it socially, or when you're in an environment where, other people are doing it, so I can try this, or I can do this. You may not even know that by using it, whether it's a little bit or a lot, depending on other factors in a person's life, genetics, trauma, emotional distress, like all of that, like these pathways can start building from that first use. So it becomes something that's a physiological dependence or a psychological dependence. And I don't think, like, for majority of people, that's not the intention. Nobody wants to be in a place where they rely on a substance, right? And I think looking at it from that compassionate lens of, like, when you think about people who are suffering with addiction or dealing with substance use, nobody wakes up and goes, I want to be addicted to something, or I want to rely on something to make me feel better.
Yeah.
So I think compassion is something that the kind of whole world or the community could use around people who are dealing with these challenges, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when, that dopamine system becomes really reinforced. My understanding is that it reduces your brain's ability to produce dopamine naturally.
Yeah.
Right. So then you really you get hooked onto that substance.
And then that's where you see, like, you're feeling great when you're using, and then your body can't produce it naturally. So then you go into, like, whether it's when you're hungover or coming off of a high or something, like you're feeling depressed, low mood, it's because your system can't produce it on its own. So then your only real way to feel better in that moment is to use again, so you can kind of feel those good feelings again.
Yeah. Use again, participate in that behavior again, whatever, physically,
right?
Eating or shopping. Yeah. I'm curious. So, we've talked a little bit about the actual, like, obvious, like, substances, but what are some of the other practices that you've maybe seen, like, personally, professionally, that constitute as, like, dependency, addiction behavior?
I think, wow, there's so many, but I think one of the big ones that I've seen in more recent years, maybe because, again, like, we're getting more open about talking about these things as well, but control over eating. So not always overeating, but having the control over what I'm putting in my body can become very compulsive and, like, chronic, and, like, the anxiety related to that. So if I'm not in control over what I'm eating, my anxiety's being heightened. But if I feel like I have that control over every kind of food I'm putting in my body, I don't feel the anxiety. And also working out or physical activity of looking a certain way, and, like, the counting calories. So that whole kind of diet culture is something I find people have become either very obsessed with or dependent on having that control, so they can look a certain way because, social media, again, that's another whole other rabbit hole we could go down.
Yeah.
But the expectations of how you should look to be accepted or desirable, people are developing these compulsive or chronic behaviors to try to fit that mold.
Yeah. Yeah, especially with exercise. I'm glad you brought that up, because that slipped my mind there for some time. But it is, I guess objectively it's healthier for you, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's something that's so socially rewarded, right? And I've, heard people in my personal life say something like, well, I need to go to the gym for that, like, dopamine hit. But at what point would you say that, say, excessive exercising becomes concerning?
Yeah, see, that is, like, even when you say that, it's like, ooh, like, that is, when you think about that question, you're like, wow, it is so socially accepted. It takes a second to, like, be like, hey, what is the line?
Yeah.
Right. I think from what I've seen and my experiences as a therapist, it's when it almost becomes, like, all consuming, like, that's the focus. And again, what would happen if you couldn't work out, or what would happen if you had to, you were in a rush and you had to stop at a Subway or Chipotle or something and grab food, and you couldn't you didn't know what calories were, what the macros were in it, right? It's that when it starts harming you in a psychological or physical or behavioral way. So for a lot of people, it's like being so strict on their diet that their body's telling them they're hungry, right? So their physiology is saying you're not eating enough. Yeah. Right. And that obviously becomes harmful in so many ways, like your lack of energy, you're not getting your nutrients, you're feeling fatigued. And then psychologically or socially, like the definition I read earlier, like, are you avoiding spending time with friends and going out for dinner because you can't control what you're eating, or you're kind of isolating yourself because you look in the mirror and you don't like what you see, or you're having body dysmorphia now, right? Due to that control. So I think those are easier to mask, though, like you're saying, because it's seen as such a positive social thing to be working out all the time and eating right. Yeah. And then someone makes a comment like, oh my God, you're looking so great. And what you've been doing is restricting your diet and working out 5 days a week, maybe twice a day. And then that's almost another dopamine hit of, oh, what I'm doing, it's working. Like that makes me feel good when people say nice things to me.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's a hard one for sure.
Yeah. Because I wonder about, like, again, where do you cross the line from discipline to dependence, right? Because it can be very, again, celebrated that, wow, look at her, she's so disciplined. And I guess that is a good trait to have. But then what would happen to you if you could, like you said, couldn't work out? Or what would happen to you if you removed this thing from your life temporarily? Yeah. How would that impact you?
And I think that's the difference I see between clients I have that are disciplined. They eat healthy most of the time. They work out regularly, versus people who are struggling with, I would say, like having some flexibility or like letting it go, or even thinking about what would happen. Like I ask clients sometimes, how would it feel? Like, we're not going to ask you to do this, but how does it even make you feel for me to ask you, how would it feel not to work out today? Or how would it feel to buy a meal or make a meal, but not track everything that you're putting in it? And you kind of see with the people that are disciplined, it's like, oh yeah, like I can totally, enjoy myself once in a while. Like that's totally fine with me. And then the difference between that and someone, you can see the anxiety, like kind of even coming out through their body language, and they kind of go, yeah, that's already bringing up all these kind of anxious feelings for me, or it's making me, feel shaky or sweaty, or the physiological of it all, right?
Yeah. So contrary to popular, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So contrary to popular belief, discipline comes with some flexibility.
Yeah.
Right.
If you try to be 100% disciplined, we all know at some point we are not perfect. At some point, there's going to be something that happens, whether it's internally with us, like we just, like people talk about binge eating because they've been controlling themselves for so long, or something external happens, like you're running behind, or you don't have time to cook, or you can't go to the gym. Something's going to test that. And sometimes that's the point where my clients go, I didn't realize this was our issue until X, Y, or Z happened. And I realized the way I'm feeling maybe isn't the healthiest when that happened.
Yeah. So often you recognize like your compulsive behavior when that behavior can't be executed.
Yeah. And I think, again, for a lot of people, that takes time to accept that. It might happen a couple of times before they really look at it, right? Like anything, I think in therapy, it takes us all time on that journey to recognize where we need to make changes, and we need to feel safe, and we need to feel secure with who we're talking to be able to bring that to the forefront for sure. But I have seen it kind of happen in that way several times.
Yeah. That's really interesting stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. There's so much there, just in that kind of, just with food or exercise, like that's this whole area.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, can you share a little bit more about what, according to just like research and literature out there, what are some of the things that can contribute to developing any sort of dependency later on in life, whether it is to substances or behaviors? Yeah.
So I think there's obviously so many factors, and they differ so greatly depending on who you are as a person, where you grew up. But research, everything I've kind of read on, worked with clients, definitely like childhood history. So like how you were brought up. Were you lacking any sense of, I guess, what you need? So whether that's attachment, safety, any of your basic needs that weren't being met, emotional availability from caregivers, that all kind of affects, I think, as you grow up, like whether you can feel safe, can you emotionally regulate? Do you have more anxiety than I don't want to say more anxiety than normal, because I feel like we all experience anxiety on some level, but more, I guess, anxiety in the way that's kind of interfering with daily life. So childhood, and then just ability to be able to regulate yourself in general. Sometimes we can develop just through life experiences, challenges with that. If you have, certain mental health, challenges. So whether that's depression, anxiety, bipolar, like anything that, you have to learn to cope with, or can be difficult to cope with. And one that I really wanted to mention that I don't feel like we talk about enough is chronic physical health or chronic health. Because getting a diagnosis of a physical health condition or a long-term condition, or having an experience with a physical health problem that can be traumatizing or cause a lot of stress, like that has such a big impact on a lot of people that I've worked with, saying that was the event that happened and then I didn't know how to cope. So I think it all really comes back to a lack of either, not being taught skills and strategies to cope with different things in your life, or an event happens when you're in your adult life, and then it's like, it's so overwhelming and it's hard. You don't maybe have the supports in the community, or maybe you don't have a great support system at home, where you're lacking those tools to be able to cope and process through that stuff. So a lot of the time, having something that's depending on whether it's a substance or behavior, is either distracting you or can help almost make the feelings go away temporarily. But most of the research shows that a lot of it is a coping. It comes from you're trying to cope with something and you don't feel like you can within what you have in yourself. Yeah,
you're trying to make those like uncomfortable feelings go away.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a very drug out.
No, not at all. I think that was very thorough. But yeah, I think exactly like coping. It all comes down to coping and emotion regulation, right? Which is just like a fancy way of saying coping with our emotions, our ability to decrease the painful emotions and increase the positive, the more pleasant emotions.
Yeah.
It really comes down to your ability to do that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't talk about it enough, but like with physical health or chronic health conditions, I just have this huge interest now more recently into the the link between physical health and our mental health, right? Like when you get a client in and they've maybe just had a heart attack and their whole life has now flipped upside down. Yeah. They have to change the way they're eating. They have to change the way they're moving, thinking to, make sure that they're taking care of keeping their heart healthy. Like that can cause a variety of then aftermath of mental health, like you're anxious now because a lot of people don't want to have another physical health problem. You're depressed because you can't do the things you used to do, or you have to pause the things you used to do for fun, or change the way you're eating. So I think that's something that really I've seen, like the link between using certain things as a way to cope with that physical health problem. And I think the exercise that we were talking about is a big one, because it's like, okay, well, that's a way I could stay healthy. It can't be bad for me. Yeah. Right. So I think, just that link, I think it needs to be talked about more. Physical health, mental health is so connected. Yeah. And I don't think there needs to be, I feel like there's almost like this line dividing like doctors and like mental health specialists. Yeah. But I think it's so intertwined with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been slowly making my way through The Myth of Normal by Dr. Gabor Mate, where he just talks about, like nervous system development and like what's happening for you externally, how it internally impacts your body. And it's just an area that we haven't explored enough. And now, thankfully, we're starting to, but it's interesting too, because I think people don't expect to hear things like that when they go to therapy.
Yeah.
Right. And almost like it can sound like kookyville a little
Yeah.
bit. So you really got to back it up with like a lot of science and like visual aids and things like that. But
yeah, definitely. When you tell people like, like your anxiety or like your gut health and your brain, like it's all connected. They're like, what?
yeah. Like,
Some more proof about this before you sell me on this topic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so connected. So you mentioned a little bit about the dopamine already, but I'm curious, are there any other ways in which addiction can change the brain or change like the nervous system?
That's something I, have to look into more. The most I've read about when it comes to addiction, the stuff that comes to the forefront when you're doing research on this stuff is that reward center.
Yeah.
But I think for sure, just in general with the nervous system, like I'm sure you see it with clients and a lot of therapists see it with clients. It's like if people don't have that behavior or that substance or that, what was the other one? Whatever the other one is, like behavior, substance mostly.
Yeah.
You can see the dysregulation in the nervous system. And I mean, I'm sure there's science behind that I could look up and read out, but like, I don't know if you've ever worked with someone, or I've worked with people and I've read research on like, if they can't get that thing or they can't do that thing, like we've talked about, like the dysregulation that happens in their body versus someone who maybe has that flexibility that we've talked about. And I say, oh, I can wait, or I can wait, till I can make it to the store to pick up that thing, or that I can go shopping, in a few days.
Yeah.
It just totally throws your nervous system out of whack.
Yeah, I can imagine that there's a lot of stress that your body goes through in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Because it's almost like that I'm never going to get that thing. And then that induces panic, anxiety, right? Fight or flight sometimes for people. It's like I'm getting out of here. I got to run away from the situation, or I need to, whatever it takes, get my hands on what I need.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I imagine when you're working with someone with addictions, you probably do a lot of work on just emotion regulation.
Yeah.
Right? Being able to recognize like our internal cues and work through that.
Yeah, just basic. I mean, I start at the basic of just listening to the body. Because even for a lot of people, like that's uncomfortable. And I think addiction or not, right? Substance use or not. I think for a lot of people, we don't tune into the body. We've learned to distract or, just distract yourself or just keep yourself busy. That way you won't feel it. Mm. But as we know as therapists, that's building and it's going to come out at some point.
One way or the other.
Yeah. So just even basic, breathe for 1 minute, or, notice when you take a breath. How does that feel? Grounding. When you start feeling nervous or anxious about whatever that behavior is or that substance is, can you kind of delay your need for it by grounding or breathing, or, having that positive talk of, I'm okay, I'm in control, I'm here, all those kind of things. Just bringing body awareness, I think. Yeah. It's such a huge stepping stone for people because it's something that they were never taught or learned about.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then you got to build your capacity to be able to regulate distress, right? So it's less likely to push you into a place where you feel like you have to rely on some substance.
Yeah. And I think you say that like your body needs to learn how to deal with distress, is because I think a lot of people dealing with any addictive behavior, that's almost what got them there in the first place. Yeah. Was the inability to deal with discomfort or stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh man, when I think about our people, when I think about like the larger South Asian community, like there is just, such a gap in like emotion regulation.
Yep.
Right? I imagine you now being a mom, I imagine, it's probably part of now how you want to raise your child. And if I ever have children in the future, probably that would include it. But like, if you think about it, like our parents and then their parents and their parents, like as a culture, larger culture, we've been stuck in survival mode for generations.
Yeah.
There hasn't been space for something like this.
Yeah. And I think you kind of just sparked this thought in my head. I was reading an article. Oh, I don't remember the therapist's name, but he has a blog. I'll have to get it to you. Yeah. But he was talking about going to his parents when he was dealing with his anxiety as a teenager. And because we've been stuck in survival mode for so long, like, you know, most of our parents came here wanting to build a better life. They were focused on working, creating stability, having enough money to put food on the table, clothes on our backs, all that kind of stuff. That when he approached his family, it was almost like get over it. Like, we don't have time for that. Like, we are trying to make a life for ourselves. Like, almost like, how dare you have the privilege to have these types of concerns or even be anxious. Right.
Yeah.
Because for them, it was like, we're just worried about making it through another day and kind of making our foundation here in this new country.
Absolutely. There's so much shame around it. You know, like, we've given you everything. What do you have to be anxious about? Or what do you have to be stressed about?
And it's interesting because, again, when I say knowledge is power, a lot of our parents don't even know that they probably have been experiencing depression or anxiety their whole life.
Oh, yeah.
They don't know how to label it or don't know the symptoms of it.
Yeah.
And like, even for, you know, that generation of people, aunts, uncles, parents in my life now, they're actually, it's interesting because through talking with my family or talking with people, they're able to say like, well, yeah, I was definitely feeling anxious.
Yeah.
Right. But like 15 years ago, I don't think anyone in my family of that generation would have said that.
Yeah.
Because they just didn't know that that was what they were feeling. They just thought that was normal.
Yeah, exactly. It's very normalized. Yeah. It's the sense of chaos that our communities have been living in. It is so normalized. This is like a totally huge side, but I am at the age now where I have started receiving a lot of unsolicited comments about starting a family. And, you know, I'll have, you know, aunties and whoever in the community say things like, oh, you know, you guys think too much. Look, we had kids at like 21 and it worked out. And it takes everything within me to really hold that back and say, well, is that the reason why most of us are in therapy? Like, you know,
right. Like, did it work out? Because
did it work out?
We all have challenges now, mental health wise.
Yeah. Like, do you want, you know, so many of us, again, like, this not to shame or blame the parents' generation. They did absolutely the best that they could. But so many of us were raised in chaos, whether it's like financial chaos, like emotional, like turmoil, like, yeah, you know, like, we survived and, you know, we're thriving.
Right.
But there's a huge caveat there. And is that how you want to do it for yourself?
Right. Yeah. I think the one thing for me, because you hear so much kind of like you said, is like, well, we gave you everything. We did the best we could. Right. That's never a message I want to pass on. Because like, as a teenager, I remember being like, and this is no kind of shame on my parents or anything. Again, like, you know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. Exactly. But it's like, I just remember being that snarky attitude-y, like 16-year-old being like, you chose to have us. So like, don't put that on me. Right. Right. So that's something I keep in my mind of like, I'm the parent and like my child is my child. And like my responsibility to raise them, be there for them, teach her, you know, how to regulate her emotions, or, you know, that it's okay to be sad and it's okay to be angry and it's okay to be happy. Like, I feel like growing up and in the South Asian community for myself and a lot of my friends, it was like, when you cried, it was like, stop crying. You have nothing to cry about. And that was, I think, our parents' way of protecting us or trying to make us feel better or stop us from feeling negatively. But it really just taught us that crying wasn't okay, or that showing emotions wasn't normal or accepted.
Yeah, because that's probably how they, again, dealt with their own pain, right? Or their
again, when you're trying to build a life for yourself in a new country with you can't speak the language. It's like, I feel sad, but I don't have time for this because I need to keep my shit together. Sorry for my family.
Yeah, you're in survival mode. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it kind of just keeps happening unless we break it somehow.
Exactly. But yeah, that like growing up in chaos and just maybe intergenerationally too, just like having that passed down, that can really contribute to us not knowing how to regulate our emotions, right? Which can kickstart maybe some dependency for so many of us. I'm curious, how would you encourage our listeners to challenge the stigma towards addiction, not just like within their community, but also within themselves? Because I'm hoping that this episode made some people like a little bit uncomfortable. It got them like thinking a little bit about their own biases. What would you want to say to our listeners?
I would say I always come back to like, first of all, you got to have the same self-compassion that you would have towards your friends and family for you. Like if this is someone listening that is, thinking about cutting back on a certain thing or wondering if it's an issue, like be compassionate for yourselves, right? We're all doing the best that we can be doing with what we have. And also, like I've said before, like learning about what it is, like when it comes to substance use or addiction, I feel like knowledge is power, like really understanding that, it's not a choice. Like people aren't waking up choosing to live this life. And at some point, this was maybe the safest thing for you to do to cope with whatever you were going through. Maybe you didn't feel safe enough to talk about it because, again, like we just discussed for a few minutes, it wasn't something that we were made to feel comfortable or safe about discussing it within our family homes because it would bring shame or it would bring embarrassment.
Yeah.
So we're truly, I think most people are doing the best they can with what they have. So bring that self-compassion. I think learn what you can. And as hard as it may be, reach out to somebody, whether it is a family member you're comfortable with, a friend. If not, reach out to a professional. And if they're not the professional that can support you, I'm sure they can guide you towards someone who can. Yeah. I think it just talking about it more. It needs to be talked about so much more.
Yeah, for sure. Not just being mindful of how you also react to someone in your circle or anyone that you kind of see in life who's struggling. It's not turn your nose up at them, right? And just be curious about what's happening for them, right? Instead of like just painting them with just this like brush of like a moral flaw. Can you just be curious about, well, I wonder what's happening for this person that is pushing them into this behavior.
Yeah. And that was, exactly what I was thinking. And I think even one more note on that is sometimes we make those judgments and it's interesting and we all do it. We all have these inherent biases that we're kind of like, sometimes I'm like, where did that come from? So it's interesting to be able to look at yourself and say, oh, I had that reaction to this person who maybe has some sort of addiction behavior that's, affecting our relationship or affecting them in a harmful way. Like say you, like you said, don't turn your nose away from them. And if you do have that sense that you want to, what is going on for you that you feel like, oh, I can't get near this, or I can't support this, or I can't be compassionate, right? It's always good to look inwards.
Yeah.
Because I think for a lot of us in the South Asian community, it is like, oh, that person has this issue or this mental health issue or this substance issue. You need to separate yourself from them completely so you don't become tainted by that issue, or people don't look at you like there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
So I think that's also something that as a community that we could do, I guess, better with or learn more about is like, like we're a big community and we're a minority, but it'd be great to, it's important to uplift each other rather than try to separate or segregate. Okay, well, they have issues, so like we're not going to associate with them.
Absolutely.
Because everyone needs somebody, and sometimes it's just that one person that you need to, help you make that change or understand yourself differently.
Absolutely. I think curiosity and compassion over, judgment. They go a long way.
Yeah. I mean, being a therapist, right? Non-judgment. That's the number one thing people are looking for when they walk through our doors, is just somewhere they can put all their stuff on the table and people aren't making faces or judging them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Did you have any books or articles that you'd want to link down below for listeners who are interested in reading a little bit more about this?
There is a podcast actually that I started listening to.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to have to pop up. I don't remember the title because I started listening to it a while back, but I believe she talks about a lot of different things, but majority is addiction and alcohol. It's called This Naked Mind.
Okay.
And it's a really good podcast if you're wanting to learn about addiction. Again, a lot of it does focus on alcohol, but like the reward systems and all of that, it's very similar.
Perfect.
And then there is this book, but I'll have to get you the title. So I'll email it to you.
Yes.
it's for people who either grew up in a home where someone had a substance use or behavior addiction or something of that sort, and for people who are trying to support someone dealing with some sort of addiction problem. I think that is something, again, that we don't talk about enough, is it's not just the person dealing with the addiction, but it can also have big impacts on the people around them as well.
Absolutely. I love that suggestion. I will also link down below In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Dr. Gabor Mate, which is, just considered like the standard in the field, or just in general. It's for everyone to just kind of get a more compassionate understanding of what really is addiction. But I know we're just kind of getting started with this conversation, and we'd love to have you again to talk more about this. But thank you so much for joining me today, Jeevan. This is really nice.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I love the opportunity to speak about these things and reach out to people, that you might not meet in your day-to-day. This is a great way to reach out to people and, make people feel less alone with the things they're dealing with, and just educating the population on, like, we're all going through something. And especially in the South Asian community, like, we don't need to feel embarrassed or shameful. Like, we all have stuff going on. So thank you for creating this platform for us to talk about these things.
Thank you. Yeah. And for everyone listening, I will link below Jeevan's socials and how to find her if you want to get in touch with her. And stay tuned for our disclaimer. The guest and the host of Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.